Just a slight health warning before I start. I am talking on 31 verses on the Sermon on the Mount within the space of, 25 minutes. So this is going to be a very quick canter through some of the richest, most dense teaching of Jesus. So what my aim is, rather than to run over time and, have you in over lunch and all afternoon, is try and give a bit of a framework for understanding the Sermon on the Mount, and particularly these 31 verses, so that you can go away and have a look at more of these verses afterwards, and maybe with that framework at the back of your mind. But to start with, I want to focus in on the key verse for today. That's the next slide, please. This is Matthew 5, verses 17 to 18. Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have come not to abolish, but to fulfill. For truly I tell you, until heaven and earth pass away, not one letter, not one stroke of a letter will pass from the law until all is accomplished. Interesting. Do you ever read the Bible and wish that Jesus was a little bit clearer? Perhaps a little bit less self-contradictory. After all, isn't this the same Jesus that says all foods are clean in the face of Jewish restrictions on the food that can be eaten in the law that he didn't come to abolish? And why, as followers of Jesus, don't we have to follow these Jewish laws today? Is that a mixed fabric item you're wearing? Last week, Martin challenged us to be salt and light. You are the salt of the earth. You are the light of the earth, Jesus told the people of Israel. He also warned the people about losing their saltiness or putting their light under a bushel. But how were the Israelites to know what it means to be salty or what it means to be a light? In order to do that, they meditated on their scriptures, the Torah, which are the first 5 books of our Bible, which are often translated in our New Testament as the law. The Torah is the story of God entering into a covenant with Israel, following the entry of sin into the world. And Israel were to be the good news of God to the world. The whole world was supposed to be blessed through this nation. And the Torah, the law, gave Israel wisdom to live by. But as we do nowadays, Israel messed this up constantly, and a group of people called the prophets, who wrote, their stories are recounted later on in the Old Testament, kept calling Israel back to their vocation to be a blessing to the whole earth, to bring God's blessing, to bring God's wisdom to the earth. The prophets also pointed towards a future when God would bring back his partnership with people on the earth to its fulfillment by bringing heaven and earth back together. What I'm going to suggest is this, that the law and prophets were the way in which God's people, the Israelites, could be marked out from their surrounding cultures, not least when they found themselves under occupation, which they often did. In other words, salt and light to show a better way to live. And yet we'll see that the way the laws were manipulated meant that they were being neither salt nor light. Instead, they turned in on themselves, using the laws to bolster the national protection for Israel. And so when Jesus says that he didn't come to abolish the law but to fulfill it, he's inviting God's people to renew their vocation as God's people. And by fulfilling the prophets, he's fulfilling the vision that the prophets had, pointing towards that future where heaven and earth finally come together and God comes down from earth. And we can see this in what Jesus teaches next. And then if we go on to the next slide. The law emphasizes the image of God in others. And there are three examples that Jesus gives here, which I've chosen choice bits of these teachings, but they're much longer than this. You have heard that it was said to those of ancient times, "You shall not murder." But I say to you that if you are angry with a brother or sister, you will be liable to judgment. You have heard that it was said, "You shall not commit adultery." But I say to you that everyone who looks at a woman with lust, and that could be a man nowadays, it could work the opposite way as well, has already committed adultery with her in his heart. And it was said, "Whoever divorces his wife, let him give her a certificate of divorce." But I say to you that anyone who divorces his wife, except on the ground of unchastity, causes her to commit adultery. And whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery. So what's going on here? Well, each of these teachings re-emphasizes the image of God that God has placed in humanity. If you might remember the story in Genesis when God creates humans, it says this: God created humankind in his image. In the image of God he created them. Male and female he created them. Every human has dignity, has worth in God's sight, and you might want to think about why we value one another, because we're each created in God's image. And so he equates anger and abuse with words on the basis that neither anger nor abuse place value on someone else's existence. He equates staring at a woman with lust, and this is more than just he or she is attractive. This is staring at someone with that kind of, desire to stir up inward kind of sexual desire, as objectifying someone, seeing someone else's existence as purely for my satisfaction. And he elevates the position of women in divorce. In Israel, only men could initiate a divorce. But effectively what he's saying here is that if you initiate divorce for reasons other than faithfulness, then a man marrying that woman is committing adultery, and also the person divorcing the woman is committing adultery. Both are equated with adultery because Jesus is elevating marriage, and importantly, it assigns the blame to the men. There's also something quite interesting going on with a debate at the time that was going on within Israel, but we'll save that one for another day. And why are these important? Well, if we think back to Martin's talk last week, he covered what we know as the Beatitudes, the sayings of Jesus of what the kingdom of heaven is looked at. And we might want to think about these verses and these teachings in the context of the fact that the meek are blessed. They'll inherit the kingdom of earth. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. And blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. So thinking about us today on a cold, wintry, well, not quite wintry, rainy morning in Temple Square Shopping Centre, I wonder in what way you or I denigrate someone's existence as made in the image of God, as an individual that's worthy of our understanding of them as created in the image of God. I didn't have to look very hard in my own life for an example of this. In fact, 6:48 to be exact, on a Monday morning at Oxford Station. Those of you who know me know that I work in London, and so I was getting my usual early morning commuter train to London. And one thing that I was going to say hate, is possibly, hopefully putting it too strongly, but one thing that irritates me is a faffer. You know, the people who get on the train with their little Brompton bikes and they take forever to get it into the bit for your luggage. And then they can't decide which seat they want. And then you go backwards and forwards. And I know what seat I want because I always sit in the same seat, in the same carriage every time. And they've got all their luggage as well, and then they take forever to move, and then there are like 20-odd commuters behind them. And normally, I'm quite good, and normally I'm the first. I know where the train door kind of opens. But on Monday morning, the train was in reverse, so the door wasn't quite where it was supposed to be. And so there was a faffer, what I call a faffer, in front of me, with a Brompton bike and with lots of luggage. And as they got on the train, I thought, oh no. And I knew exactly what was going to happen, and it did happen. But rather than be of any use to said faffer, I just stood there, getting more and more irritated with them. And this was at a time when I'd already prepared some of this talk. And like I say, I didn't really have to look very far for an example of me becoming angry or irritated. And Jesus warns, just after verse 22, that calling someone you fool, he says that someone who calls someone you fool will be liable to hell or fire. Well, I won't. I won't let you know what was going through my mind at that moment, but it was possibly a bit stronger than you fool. And I wonder, in life in general, when you have to speak to someone on one of those lines because a delivery has not turned up, or something wrong has been delivered, or you've received a delivery that's broken, or something like that, and you take that out on the other person you speak to. Or perhaps it's the way in which you view the opposite sex, and it may not go as far as lust. It may go as far as in the workplace, not treating a man and a woman equally. Or perhaps it's your attitude towards children, whether those be your own or more particularly those of other people. And in what ways are you carrying around anger within you? And these are all ways in which this teaching about the inherent value of fellow humans can apply to our lives. And then Jesus comes on to another three teachings, which I've kind of chosen some choice verses from. And these all are directed towards our relationships with other people. Again, you have heard that it was said to those of ancient times, you shall not swear falsely, but carry out the vows you've made to the Lord. But I say to you, do not swear at all. Let your word be yes, yes, or no, no. And some translations there say, let your yes be yes, and your no be no. And again, you have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I say to you, do not resist an evildoer. Or again, you have heard that it was said, you shall love your neighbour and hate your enemy. But I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. And so we see Jesus telling us not to swear oaths, but to let our word be our word. If you say yes to something, do it. But a practice had grown up at the time of the Israelites swearing by other things in a way of kind of tricking people into believing that they'd agreed to something more than just a yes being yes. So, for example, they would maybe perhaps swear on the temple rather than swear on God, so that in their own minds they hadn't sworn to God, but they'd sworn on something. But trust and integrity are keys to good relationships and honouring the image-bearing nature of our brothers and sisters. An eye for an eye is nowadays seen as a right to retaliation. But actually, that law to the Israelites was a way of limiting retaliation to something that was proportionate. And Jesus is saying, let's go even further than this. Let's not just limit your right to retaliation, but don't instigate retaliation in the first place. And instead, he commands to love our neighbour and to pray for our enemies. And notice there, you've heard that it was said, you shall love your neighbour, and we know that's one of the Ten Commandments, if we've read the Ten Commandments before, and hate your enemy. But that's not what the Ten Commandments says. That bit had been added on at some point. Well, why? Well, again, going back to the Beatitudes that Martin was talking about last week, blessed are those who hunger for righteousness. Blessed are the peacemakers, and blessed are the meek. I wonder in what ways our interactions with other people are perhaps less straightforward than they might be. Maybe you agree to do something but kind of don't follow through on it. Maybe you manipulate people or situations to get your own way, or take advantage of other people's ignorance into what you are getting them into. And aren't we all aware of the consequences in the world of retaliation? And Jesus isn't saying here, there is no justice. But elsewhere in the Bible it says, vengeance is God's. We can rely upon God for justice. You know, it's easy to get into a lose-lose situation with these things. For example, if you think about the arms race, you know, who is going to be the first one to step out of an arms race? Because whichever way you go, you lose. If you stop building up your own arms, then that's a signal to the other country that you've lost. So you've got to continue building up arms. But no one's going to use those arms because of the destruction it will cause. And let me ask you, who is your enemy today? Is it someone at work? Someone who you're competing with for that higher position? Or someone who got that higher position when you thought actually they ought not to have? Someone who's hurt you in the past? Maybe you're in business and it's a commercial competitor. Or maybe your enemy is, you know, maybe your enemy is a political enemy. Maybe your enemy is someone who voted the different way from you, from the referendum that we all remember 8 years ago. Or maybe it's someone who had different views from you on COVID and whether people should be staying at home and isolating or vaccinated. There are deep divisions in our lives, and I think these teachings of Jesus are asking us to look at those divisions and pray for the people on the other part. Now, often the teaching here is, you will hear kind of comments that actually what Jesus is teaching is a heart position on what the Israelites were interested in was the kind of outward act position, and they were being legalistic, and Jesus was teaching what our heart's position should be. Now, that's not quite right, because what then happens is that we over-spiritualize these teachings. They become teachings for us in our own private spirituality and not lived out in our lives. And we've inherited that. I won't go into the history, but we've inherited that from kind of Greek philosophy, from Platonism, from ideas from the Enlightenment. But that's not what's happening here. Jesus is calling us into a radically integrated life where our heart and our acts are joined together. And this is what was to characterize Israel as God's true people. And it's what ought to characterize us as God's people today. And I wonder, this got me wondering, in what way are we, the church, like the Pharisees, who were giving these teachings back in the time of the Israelites, using kind of shallow, legalistic interpretations of the law? It's interesting because the Pharisees get quite a bad press in the New Testament because they're constantly portrayed, certainly in Matthew's Gospel, as the enemies of Jesus, the enemies of the kingdom of God. But actually, the Pharisees were the progressives. There are lots of factions within Judaism, and two of them you may read about in the New Testament were the Sadducees and the Pharisees. And the Pharisees were, unlike the Sadducees, interested in interpreting the Torah, interpreting God's law for the situations that the Israelites were coming across in their everyday lives. And they developed, therefore, something called the written Torah, which is the 5 books of the Torah, but also what's called the oral Torah, which is what the Pharisees' interpretations for everyday lives were. You know, they were the kind of biblical interpreters of their day. But the problem is that this also had a flip side, in that whenever Israel spent huge amounts of time under oppression, and so keeping Torah and what the Pharisees were interpreting became a way of reinforcing Israeli nationalism, the Jewish nationalism of the day. And I wonder in what way we kind of, as the church, as God's people today, reinforce our own nationalism, for which I mean reinforce our own individuality as the church. You know, maybe it's the practices we have as a church that are alien to outside people. Maybe it's the way in which whenever there is a kind of something that we could consider contrary to Jesus' teaching, the way in which we deal with that. And actually, this weekend, when I was thinking about this even more, I was reminded of this passage in Romans 8. And in Romans 8:22, Paul says, "We know that the whole creation has been groaning in labour pains until now. And not only the creation, but we ourselves, who've been the first fruits of the Spirit, groan inwardly while we wait for the adoption, the redemption of our bodies." And so what Paul's saying there is, it's an invitation for us to join in with the whole groaning of creation. Join in with where we see despair. Join in with that despair in lifting it to God. where we see issues in the outside world, to join in with them and lifting that to God. You see, the world is not God's enemy. This is the final slide. As we've seen, God said, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. In fact, the word used when Jesus said not to resist an enemy is a technical term for military revolutionary resistance. And there were lots of revolutionary movements in Jesus' time, keen to revolt against the occupying Romans. And so these words are telling, don't join the resistance movement, instead show love and generosity to those outside of God's people. In what ways do we shut down, hoard and protect our own comfort when challenged? The philosopher Nietzsche famously said that human beings are some of the most vulnerable animals. If you think about it, we don't have sharp teeth, we don't actually run very fast, we don't have a sting in our tail. But what we do have is a developed frontal cortex and the ability to communicate with our fellow man. And so in what ways, whenever we're challenged, maybe like the Israelites felt challenged, like the Pharisees felt challenged when they were trying to protect Israel's national identity, do we feel vulnerable and we draw up the drawbridge? When actually I think Jesus here is saying to do the opposite of that, to use our communication, to open up those lines of communication, like I say, to join in with all of creation's groaning for the day when Jesus returns. And Jesus gives some examples of this. He says, if anyone strikes you on the right cheek, turn the other also. Now, with these phrases, I'm going to quickly rattle through them, but I'm going to rely upon the theology of an American guy called Walter Wink. If you want to know any more about this, kind of Google his name and Sermon on the Mount, and you'll find tons of stuff. But turning the other cheek is an allusion to the suggestion that if someone strikes you on the right cheek, they're doing that with the back of their hand, and so not treating you as an equal. If you turn your left cheek to them and they want to hit you, then they'll have to use the palm of their hand, which will mean treating you as an equal. If anyone wants to sue you and take your coat, give your cloak as well. And the idea here is that giving your cloak would leave you naked, and therefore be shocking and expose the powers of evil for what they really are. I wonder how many of us are willing to be exposed to reveal the powers of evil for what they are. And then if anyone forces you to go 1 mile, also go the 2nd mile. And here the story is that apparently a Roman soldier could force someone to carry their belongings for 1 mile. And some say carrying it for a 2nd mile will get the Roman soldier into trouble. But whatever the case is there, at the very least, the person carrying it is being told to carry out an act of radical generosity. And so this is the proof that that God is not the world's enemy. He sent his only Son to show us what it means to follow the law, to fulfill the law, that whilst Jesus taught to turn the other cheek, he was spat on, struck and slapped before the high priest. Whilst Jesus taught to carry a Roman soldier's belongings an extra mile, he was forced to carry his burden on the road to Golgotha. While Jesus taught to give your coat and your cloak as well, his clothes were stripped off him and divided up. And so Jesus came to teach not only was the law abolished, but he came to fulfill it. And Jesus is now reigning. He's reigning over a kingdom in which which is the kingdom of the poor in spirit. It's the kingdom of those who mourn, the kingdom of the meek, the kingdom of those who hunger and thirst for righteousness. It's the kingdom of the merciful, the kingdom of the pure in heart, the kingdom of the peacemakers, and the kingdom of the persecuted. Do we act like Jesus is on the throne of this kingdom? Do we take upon ourselves as Christ's people, as the church, the vocation of spreading his love to enemies, acting with integrity and honouring the God image in each other? And so I'll end with Paul's words. If anyone is in Christ, new creation, the old has passed away and everything is new. Amen.